Hello, and welcome to Demo 29.6, integrating a RESTful repository using dynamic OAuth tokens. We will be using Whitec GENESYS as an example repository for this demonstration. GENESYS is a system architecture modeling environment. Recent versions of GENESYS provide a REST API that we will be using to integrate GENESYS with Syndeia. Specifically in this video, we'll cover the following. We'll show you how to add a RESTful repository that uses a dynamic token for authentication. In this case, GENESYS uses OAuth tokens. We'll show you how to add new RESTful requests to the GENESYS repository, specifically to get projects, get project by ID, get components in a project, get requirements in a project, and then viewing those responses in the Syndeia web dashboard. With that, let's dive into the demo. GENESYS provides a REST API that is available for users to query data in the GENESYS repository. You can see the endpoints and the categories of those endpoints in here in the Swagger API. We'll be using some of these endpoints to work with GENESYS. Specifically, we'll be using the endpoint to get the token, get the OAuth token in particular. We'll be using the projects-related endpoint to get details about projects. And we'll be using the entities endpoint to get different types of entities like components and requirements. Out here, I'm going to go to the Syndeia web dashboard, and you see a repository category called RESTful here. I'm going to click on the plus icon next to it to add a RESTful repository. I'm going to give it a URL. Now, this is the API URL for GENESYS. So it's the GENESYS server /API/v1. I'm going to give it a name to this repository, GENESYS RESTful. Give it a description. And now for the authentication type, I'm going to use dynamic option here. What this opens up is a form that I can use to provide the specifics that are required by the API to generate the OAuth token. If I go to GENESYS token endpoint, I will see here that it requires different types of inputs, grant type, username, and password, to be able to generate a token, which I can then use for any subsequent calls. This token will expire, so when it expires, we'll have to recreate this token. Now, this is already handled by Syndeia web dashboard. So all that Syndeia is asking you for this point is tell me which endpoint to call to get the token. And if the token expires, Syndeia is going to create a new token by calling the same endpoint. Syndeia is also smart enough that once a token is generated, it's going to use the token for any subsequent calls that you make through the Syndeia web dashboard. So we'll see an example of that here. So in this case, for this dynamic authentication type, Syndeia is asking what endpoint in GENESYS, in this case, I need to hit to get the token. So the endpoint I need to hit is a post endpoint, specifically the post token endpoint. So we'll select the method here, post. In this case, we'll provide the path. The path is the endpoint. Now you'll also see a field here for Auth URL. Sometimes the actual URL that you need to hit to get a token is different from the repository URL. This is very common when you have a single sign-on kind of capability where there's one authentication server that is serving many different applications running on different servers. So in that case, instead of using the base URL with the path, you can also provide a dedicated Auth URL that you need to hit for getting the token. But that's not the case here. We're making a post request to the token endpoint using the same repository URL. Now, as you saw, to get the token, we need to provide certain inputs in the body of that post. So we'll go to the request body. In this case, it's a form body, and we'll provide the inputs there. The first input is grant type, password in this case. We'll click the plus button. Don't forget that. Second one is username, and I'll provide my username here. Click the plus button. The third one is password, which is my password to get the OAuth token from GENESYS. I'll provide that here. And once I do that, the other input I need to provide is the response payload location, which means that when a request is sent to the token endpoint with these form parameters, these form values, and the response comes back from GENESYS, which field in that response carries the token? The specific field in GENESYS API, which would carry the token, is the access token field. So basically, we're telling Syndeia that make this request, a post request to the token endpoint with this data, and when the response comes back, pick the value of the token from the access token field. Now you've got two options here, how to use the token in subsequent requests. In this case, the OAuth token that will be obtained here will be used as a bearer token, which is kind of the default way these APIs work. But you can also have a case where the token you obtain can be sent as a header not as an authorization header with the bearer token, but a different header. And if that's the case, then you can specify that by toggling this switch. But in this case, the token is sent as a bearer token. With that, I will press on the create button. This will add a GENESYS repository to the Syndeia web dashboard as a RESTful repository. We'll click on the GENESYS repository here. This takes a few seconds to initialize in Syndeia Cloud. And then we'll be ready to add a few requests to get data out of GENESYS. So in this case, I'll right click and go to the Manage Restful Requests and Collections panel. I'll go to the Request tab, click the Add button. And the first request I want to make is get all projects. And I will add a description here, request to get all projects. And the endpoint for that is projects. Now, interestingly, what's going to happen here is that before this request is made, Syndeia Cloud will automatically call the token endpoint and get a token and pass that token with this request as a send. If the token expires, it's going to call the endpoint again to get a fresh token. So it caches the token and calls the token endpoint if that expired. So moving on, we call the project's endpoint. We click on the test button here, and we see we got a response. So which means that Syndeia was able to obtain the token and send a request to get all projects with that token. And we press the save button to add that request. Now that request has been added. If I expand the default collection, I will see the get all projects request here. If I expand that request, the request is sent to GENESYS by Syndeia Cloud, and we get a response. The part of the response here that we're interested in is the results section. And again, this is data coming from GENESYS. Syndeia is not filtering this data. Syndeia is not transforming this data. It is serving the data as it came from the GENESYS server through GENESYS REST API as a JSON. Syndeia is serving that in the repository tree. So if you expand results, you'll see 2 projects have been returned, and each of them have 23 fields. The first project is Drone Design Phone App, and the second project is called the Drone Design Master. So there are 2 projects, and there are different other fields available with each of those projects. So that's how you get all projects. Now let's say if I wanted to get a specific project. Now the GENESYS API provides an endpoint to do that. If I go to the projects endpoint, there's an endpoint to get project by ID. So we'll use that. We know that each project has an ID, which is right here. So if I wanted to get just the Drone Design Master, I can make a request to get that specific project by ID. So we'll right click here and go to Manage Restful Collections and Requests panel, go to the request, and this time I can clone this request, and we can say get the Drone Design Master project and update the description, request to get the drone design project. And then for the URL, the path we'll use is project / the ID of that drone design project, which is a UID. And we click on the test button and we get a response back. We click the clone button, and that way we have now added a request to get a specific project. And if I expand the response, here you don't see the 2 projects, you only see 1 project being returned, and that's the Drone Design Master project with that ID that we requested and all the data that GENESYS has returned us with. Now, what if I want to find all the components in the Drone Design Master project? Components are like system elements that are in the Drone Design system model. To do that, we have to add another request. So we'll go ahead and clone this request and say get components in Drone Design Master project, update the description, request to get components in the Drone Design project. And for that, you have to use a different endpoint, and that looks something like this. So it's a project and the ID of the project, followed by entities by class, and this is the type of the entity, which means every type in GENESYS has an ID. So component is a type, requirement would be another type, and it has an ID. So you have to provide, you want to get elements of a certain type or entities of a certain type, so you have to provide that ID. I'll speak a little bit later about how to get these IDs of the different types. But if I click on the test button here, I would get all the components. And if I get clone, I would get all components. Let's go ahead and add another request to get all requirements. So I'll clone the request to get all components and just make some changes here. Get requirements in drone design, request to get requirements in the drone design project. And here, the type for requirement is something else. So just the last part of that URL would change. So we still want to get all the entities in that project, but the type of the entity is a requirement and has a different ID than component. So we update that, click test, that works, click clone, and that will add this request to Syndeia Cloud. We'll close this. And if I refresh this collection, now we see two new requests here, get all components in the drone design master project. If I expand this, I will see 4 results, and then one of them is the results sub.json, which has got 40 components apparently have been returned, and they're listed here. And if I look at the first component, that's the first component I see here. Now you don't see the name or any identifiable attribute for this component. You would expect a name, but all of that is under the attribute section for this component. And if you look at each attribute, it has got the ID of the attribute. It doesn't have the name of the attribute, and it's got the value of the attribute. So in this case, I know that the last and the second last attributes are of key importance to us. So here, if I look at the value, this is GPS satellite, so it's probably the name attribute. And the last attribute here would be, if I expand the value, would be the hierarchical number, C3. So it's kind of the identification of that GPS satellite. So C3 GPS satellite is one of the components out of the 40 components in the drone design master project. Now, the way this API returns results, you're not getting the names of the attributes, you're getting IDs, and so it may make a little cumbersome to figure out which ID is what attribute name. I'll speak to you a little bit about it towards the end on how you can make this easier to work with, but at least you saw that we get all the components. Now, similarly, if I expand the request to get all requirements, that request is sent by Syndeia Cloud to GENESYS server, and then we get a response back, and here we get 45 requirements. Let's pick the first requirement. Again, let's go to the attribute section. Let's go to the last one here. Look at the value, that is the requirement ID number. And if you look at the second last, it will probably have the name of the requirement, which is the video drone system video capability requirement. And if I expand another attribute here, I would have the value, which probably is the text of the requirement. The video drone system shall allow the user to capture video at the user request. So here you're getting the requirement ID, requirement name, and the plain text requirement. So again, this shows you an example of how to work with GENESYS. Now, if you want to get a specific component, you can also do that. There's an endpoint to get a component by ID. So we could do that very easily to go to entities, project entity by ID, and that we could get very easily, same way as we got project by ID. Now, as I said, the way this API is responding you have to know the definition IDs of these attributes to figure out which attribute is what. And to make this easier, you need to make a couple of calls. You need to first make a call to their schemas endpoint or the project endpoint, which is shown here. Let's go to the schemas endpoint for a project. Here you need to make a call to get all the schemas of the project, which means all the type definitions, where you'll see what is the component, what is the requirement, what are the attributes a component can have, what are the attributes a requirement can have. Then you would pick up the right attribute or the ID of the attribute you need, for example, the name attribute or the ID attribute. You would pick up the definition ID of that, and then you can look up the data. Now it requires 2 calls, one to get the schema, and then other, when you're actually getting all the components, you need to figure out which attribute is what. And because you need to make a few chained calls, this is best suited to use in a Jupyter Notebook-like environment. All the actions we're doing here through the web dashboard are also available through the Syndeia Cloud REST API. So here, for example, if I go to REST, there is a collection of endpoints available in the Syndeia Cloud API to deal with any RESTful repository, to make a request, to create collections, just the way you've been seeing. And we use Jupyter Notebooks to make those chained calls. So for example, in this case, we are able to get all those components that you saw, but we're also able to do that second lookup and then provide the names of the components, the number, and the description. So here you can see a nicely formatted table, which we're producing by calling the Syndeia Cloud API, which behind the scenes is calling GENESYS API to get the data, to get the names of all the 40 components and their ID numbers. And if I go down further, you can get another table which looks at the drone design component, the top level component or the assembly, and looks at all the 15 components it has. It's looking at the immediate parent-child relationship from the drone design component. And it's got 15 components. Same with requirements. You can actually get the IDs of the requirements and the name and the description of the requirements, all 45 of them generated as a table by making an API call through Syndeia Cloud API, which then forwards to GENESYS and fetches a result. And you can display the results here by using Jupyter Notebooks. In summary, this video was about demonstrating to you how to add a RESTful repository that uses dynamic OAuth tokens. We showed you how to add RESTful requests to get projects, get project by ID, get components, get requirements, and viewing responses in the Syndeia web dashboard. And we also showed you how the same things we're doing in the Syndeia Cloud web dashboard can be done through the Syndeia Cloud API, the fact that you can make many calls and combine the results into producing tables in a Jupyter Notebook-like environment. Syndeia provided a Python client, which you can install in Jupyter Notebook to achieve this. There are different types of authentication that RESTful repositories can bring. This video was about showing you how to work with RESTful repositories that have a dynamic auth token, which is OAuth in this case. We hope that this demonstration video was useful to you. If you have any questions or concerns about this video or exercising by adding a repository that has a dynamic auth token, you can reach us at our help desk at www.intercax.com/help. Thank you and have a great day.